Welcome to Thinking Green. I am Ronna, and as I'm sure you all know, Election Day is exactly 2 weeks away, November 6th. The last day to register to vote routinely is October 30th. You can go into the registrar's office. You can register online at the Secretary of State website, and you can mail it in, and I think as long as it's postmarked by the 30th, you're okay. If you turn 18 or move to a new place between November 1st and Election Day, you can still register. And we do also have Election Day registration in Connecticut, which maybe we'll talk about in detail a little bit farther on in the show. So in keeping with the series we've been doing with various Green Party candidates, tonight's guests are Brian Gay, who is running for Registrar of Voters in East Hampton, Connecticut. And joining us also is Doug Larry. And Doug was, I think, the very first Green Party candidate for Registrar of Voters in Wyndham in 2012, I believe.
Yes.
And so he currently works as a regional election monitor in the Northeast region. And so we'll be talking a lot about voting, elections, what the Registrar of Voters does, and why it's a good idea to get the Green Party into that. So welcome, Brian. Welcome, Doug.
Thank you.
I'm going to start with you, Brian, and ask you, how did you originally get involved in political activism or Green Party politics?
Yeah, sure. So starting for the Green Party at least, it was in 2012. I had just come out recently in about 2009 and was just finishing up school in Providence, Rhode Island. And it was the 2012 presidential election, and I found myself very frustrated with the two major parties because I found that neither one really represented what I believed in, and especially as a queer person, there wasn't much representation in either party at that time, or support policy-wise. So I don't remember how I came across Dr. Jill Stein, but learned about her campaign, and then went to one of her rallies in Providence, Rhode Island, and became a fan, and then started to follow her campaign. Voted Green in 2012, and then shortly thereafter registered. I moved back to Massachusetts, registered in the Green Rainbow Party in Massachusetts, and then relocated to Connecticut about 3 years ago when I got involved more heavily in the Green Party of Connecticut. So. And
was that really your first foray into political action, or had you been working on gay rights issues or before that?
No, so before that. So my family had been involved in local politics to a certain extent. So my mother was involved in town politics in the town that I grew up in Massachusetts. So there was some background there. I've heard stories about my grandparents, my Nana in particular, who was involved. They were both very staunch Democrats from the Depression era, and so were involved in labor rights and protesting. Actually, George Wallace came to the town that I grew up in when I was in high school, and so they were involved in protesting when he was there, trying to pretty much make a stand in opposition to the anti-civil rights movement, which was happening at the time, and which had a foothold in the town that I was from in Massachusetts too.
And it was the Democratic Party down there that was, at the forefront of that anti-civil rights movement.
Dixiecrats.
Yeah, and which is interesting, and I think that there was a conflict between that, contingent within the Democratic Party, but then also the values that my mother's family had, and so that created conflict, and so they stood up for what they saw as human rights and civil rights, which they supported. So there was some background like that in the family, and then when I went to school, I took Intro to Poli-Sci, which introduced me to feminism, and that was kind of my first exposure to that. And also environmentalism was in that class. I got involved in the environmental group on campus, the student group. I had been involved, my family was also involved in the pro-life movement when I was younger, so I had been exposed to going and hearing testimony and going to marches for that movement, which may be interesting to some people as a current Green. But there was the perspective, again, from the values that my family had, that it was standing up for people and for their rights and trying to represent people who are underrepresented, which then ended up transferring over to the other movements that I learned about, like the women's rights movement, the queer LGBT movement, and of course the environmental movement as well. So I also, when I was in college, got some exposure to socialism, and so started to learn a little bit about that and how it's related to LGBT issues. And so kind of begrudgingly at first, but then as I learned more about it, kind of appreciated what it has to offer, and so that informed me as well.
I saw a great quote just today, something like, if you're not at the table, you're on the table. and I think a lot of us who get into politics sort of grudgingly do it for that reason. It's going to happen whether we're involved or not, and if we're not involved, we're more likely to be victimized by it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Doug, going back to 2012, what made you decide to run for Registrar of Voters? It hadn't been done yet in Connecticut.
I had been working in the Fortune 500 to about 2007, and then sort of outsourced, globalized, and pushed further away from money to about 2010. A friend of mine was running for an important office in my town. Jean Dismay was our first Green Chief Executive Officer in the state. She was the last First Select woman. And as I helped her with her campaign for 2009, I realized the quality of the data could use improvement. That when we sent out a mailing, a third or more would come back. That the addresses might be legally appropriate but incomplete. The zip 4 might be wrong. The apartment numbers were often missing. They were sometimes juxtaposition, dyslexic, 17, 71. They were undeliverable. And so I spent a lot of the rest of the campaign working on data quality. And then gradually I had more opportunities to work with the Registrar of Voters on things like legislative districts after the census of 2010, and where will our polling station be, and how many people show up for elections, and therefore how many parking spaces do I need per hour? And that sort of analytical approach to, this is a process for electing our leaders, but it's also a process for people being heard. And I was concerned that you couldn't get a bus into one of the polling stations, that some of the polling stations didn't have enough parking spaces for people to feel welcome. And so I got into it from there's great data here. And as a data guy, I felt I could be useful.
Now, Registrar of Voters, for people who live in New London, this idea of having a third-party Registrar of Voters is just a foreign concept. I think we are the only town in the state where we do not elect registrars of voters. The Democrats appoint one, the Republicans appoint one. There's no election, there's no possibility of getting it beyond an office of representing those two parties. So what I'd like to talk about, I think, is what is the value of having a Registrar of Voters in town who isn't a Democrat and isn't a Republican?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I would say that I think something that's important to remember is that over 60% of voters, I think that's nationwide, but also in Connecticut, and a majority of voters in my town that I'm from, East Hampton as well, are unaffiliated. They're not a Democrat, they're not a Republican. So I think it's important that, given the fact that the majority of voters aren't even members of those two parties, to have those two parties controlling the whole process, I think is questionable. And I think it's only reasonable to have someone who's not a member of the two parties, who's a member of that third group of people who are either unaffiliated or of a minor party like the Green Party, to be able to participate in that process. It's an independent lens to view it through. I think I'd be impartial insofar as I'm not tied to the two power-holding parties in the town. So I think that would be helpful.
And I actually did this afternoon look at the East Hampton numbers, not real recent, from 2012, and it is pretty much 50-50, very close to that. Half of the registered voters in your town are Democrats or Republicans. The other half are something else, either unaffiliated or minor party members. And although I know the registrars will always say once they're in the job they behave in a nonpartisan way, I think that may be true but is not guaranteed to be true.
Well, during business hours.
It's true.
Yes, when they're working for the public, generally speaking, they try to behave in a nonpartisan fashion. But some of them will slip and behave in a bipartisan fashion, which isn't quite the same.
No. Well, I heard something kind of frightening. People might know that Fred Link recently tried to get on the ballot to run for U.S. Senate as a socialist action candidate. He did not succeed. And in one city, when they looked at what had happened with the signatures, unaffiliated registered voters' signatures were not counted. They were thrown out. And I don't even know, I won't even say it's malicious. I think that they're kind of myopic or biopic if it's if it's a registrar who's a Democrat and Republican. They don't even think about the half of the voters that aren't one or the other. So
Well, and they've been doing petitions for primaries, and the primaries are solely of those two large parties in our state.
That's
and
true.
so they've been staring at pages for weeks that you were one party or you were the other party. And then they get petitions from some other candidate who isn't a member of those two large parties, and they might naturally stay in the vein of wrong party, wrong party.
Yeah.
No party at all. Oh my gosh.
It doesn't
Yeah.
necessarily
It
have to be
doesn't-
malicious for us to
Doesn't
fix
have
it.
to be malicious.
Oh, right.
but
No, and I wouldn't argue
does
that it's
appear
malicious
Yeah.
in my
quite
town.
a few signatures got ignored that were unaffiliated.
So and there just isn't that knowledge base. So I'm guessing that running as a Green for Registrar of Voters, it's not that easy to get elected, but it is possible. So maybe you can explain how you could become a registrar.
Sure. So, per Connecticut statute, as I understand it, so jump in and correct me if I'm wrong, but from what I've researched and what I've found and what other people have shared information with me, like Doug, who's a wealth of information, is that Connecticut mandates that each town, and it gets into more intricate detail, but essentially each town's mandated to have a Democrat and a Republican registrar. That's mandatory. They have to have those two. And then if someone else from a minor party or an unaffiliated individual decides to run, they would have to score more than either the Democrat or the Republican in order to then get office.
So if you come in second place or first place, you'd be a third registrar.
Correct, yes. And what's also the point that I made in a letter to the editor of the newspaper of the town that I live in East Hampton, was that you can vote for me or vote for someone who's unaffiliated or a minor party, and it doesn't hurt the Democrat or Republican, because even if they get 0 votes, they still
They'll
get the
get
position.
in.
Yeah, they still get it. So.
If they don't run, they can still be appointed, because the office must be filled by a person from each of the two largest parties. It doesn't explicitly say this party and that party, but the two largest, and for quite some time that's been those two. Yeah.
Wow. So there is a possibility, and it seems as though voter education would go a long way towards helping third registrars get in.
Well, and it's happened. Hartford had a third registrar.
That's
The
true.
Working Families Party managed to elect a person in 2008, I believe, and again in 2012.
And then they changed the system.
Well,
something.
lots of things happened, but basically she got more votes than the Republican. Hartford's a huge city. Its Republican voter base is small, and its Democratic voter base is huge. And the Working Families Party ran a fairly qualified candidate, I might add, not just a wannabe. And she won twice. and did fairly well. So that was an example of a third party coming in second, more than once. And we seek to do it again. Races have occurred with Greens coming in third place, of course, out of 3. I came in about mid-teens, 15 or so percent. Another candidate in my town did. And the Republicans were getting in the mid to low 20s. So it wasn't like we were a distant shot, just not quite enough to be in second.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there are 2 things. One, people don't understand that a vote for you is not a vote against the Republican or
No.
Democratic candidates.
Correct.
And there are some people who worry, oh, will it cost my town more to have 3 registrars?
Yes, and that was a specific concern that was raised in my town
yeah.
by one of the 2 registrar candidates, maybe both of them, but I only heard about it from one of them. And that the issue being, we can't afford this right now. My town is in a budget crisis. We've had 4 elections or 4 referenda so far this year, trying to pass a municipal budget. We have a municipal budget and then an education budget, and the 2 sides can't agree on what's going to happen with that. So they've had 4 referenda, and each time it keeps failing by more and more people.
That costs more than you do.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh,
Okay.
yeah.
Oh, I
The
didn't
cost
know
of
that.
a
Each
referendum is
referendum.
quite high.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay. See, I,
A few thousand.
oh, okay. Yeah,
So,
that's a
you know,
good point to make then.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, because they.
And of course, if there is a budget for voting processes, election workers, shall we say, and you happen to be one of them, that doesn't necessarily mean the budget needs to be a lot higher. For instance, other workers who've been hired in the past might work less. Deputies might work less. Assistant registrars might work less. Any clerical staff might work less. Even moderators might work less. If you were to be elected as registrar, it simply means there's one more person with this title. The budget doesn't necessarily need the change. And in some towns, that might even be appreciated. Some towns have registrars who have been pushed to their capacity. Their other jobs are in danger. In Sterling, for instance, one of the registrars was told, come back to work. You've taken too many days off.
Oh, okay.
You know, so in some towns it could be a blessing.
Oh, yeah, and I think in our town, especially with the budget constraints and the fact that the current at least one of the current registrars has been very vocal about how much they've been working and how much of a burden it is in terms of the extra hours they have to put in and coordinating all of these special elections or referenda rather. So the way I see it, it's an extra set of hands it's 3 for the price of 2. You get 3 registrars for the same price as 2 and extra hands at the
And
top.
it's a lumpy business. You have a lot of work to do in narrow time periods. More hands for those narrow time periods is useful. And then we can all take a break during the other times or keep the office open a little more, whichever they decide. It depends on the service level desired, but more people means you can handle the spikes. Elections are not a small task.
No, and they're major. So on the campaign trail, what have your experiences been?
Yeah, so it's been pretty digital so far. So I've a good portion of the time. Actually, it's helpful to go over process a little bit. So just to initially get on the ballot involved, first you had to submit an application to petition because as a minor party candidate, Democrats and Republicans can go through their party structures, I believe, to be able to seek the position.
Yeah, and every line is kind of automatically theirs.
Right.
Yeah, right.
And so for me to be able to even run for Registrar of Voters in East Hampton, I had to first submit an application to the Secretary of State's office. David Bedell, who's another Green in the state party, helped me with that process, showed me the paperwork I needed to fill out, where the signatures were needed, what specifically needed to go where, and then who to give it to, which is the town clerk. So I gave it to them. But then I think also it's important for the towns to get some additional education on how minor parties play a role in the system, because our town clerk, very helpful when I went in, I was excited to see that I was trying to go for the office, but when it came time to then submit the paperwork to Secretary of State's office, there was an issue with it not getting received by the deadline. They sent it in on time, but they didn't send in all the pages. They only sent in 1 page of the packet. So it was initially a problem. Secretary of State ended up accepting it, so it was fine.
But it could have not been fine.
Right, yeah, so.
There were a couple nervous days there, if I recall.
Yeah, and that wasn't the first, because that happened with that. And then later on, so after I applied, that was to apply just for the petitioning paperwork, to then be able to ask for neighbors to sign off and essentially approve of my going for the office. So I collected the necessary number of signatures, handed that into the town clerk's office, and then with that case, it got sent into the Secretary of State's office, and then I received word, it was right around the primary time, so it was a few weeks later, or about a month later, sometime in late August, that unfortunately I didn't make the cut because I hadn't collected enough signatures. And so I was confused because we had ran the numbers as to how many signatures I would need. And so I checked, I think with you, Doug, and with David, and was just like, okay, did we not need 1%? Because that was my understanding. And then what it turned out was that the Secretary of State's office had actually, I think, miscalculated it. And so I sent them the percentage that was needed.
Innocent enough error, but it,
yeah.
Tough on the candidate who was told, you're not on the ballot, dude.
Yeah.
It's like, whoa.
Yeah,
that
after
was-
it's too
But
late to
essentially, they had
rectify.
compared it to 10% instead of 1. A simple enough error, ordinary math error, but devastating for a candidate. And had he not had support from other people who were familiar with the process, he might have easily been discouraged from running and not realized this was a simple, correctable error.
Absolutely, yeah.
And that points to the fact that it's kind of useful in towns to have a Green Party presence because the registrars and the clerks don't really know the rules if we're not there to tell them the rules.
Or teach them.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, New London has had a town committee now for a decade, since 2008. And state law says that whenever the chair of the Democratic Town Committee and the chair of the Republican Town Committee receive any kind of notification, the chair of the Green Town Committee has to get it too.
Oh,
And 3 years ago, we were not notified about something. And we did complain to the State Election Enforcement Commission. And we were correct. Nothing really happened to the registrars, which was fine. I didn't want them to get fined or lose their job. I went in there afterwards and said, I felt bad, but we've been around for a long time. You can't forget us.
Yeah.
And and they won't forget us now. And but they don't know this stuff automatically until you're there and present. They really don't know what their obligations are. And I'm thinking the 10% is because there were a lot of primaries forced in the major parties. And for those primaries, they do need to get 10% of the people registered in their
Yeah,
party.
which is a very high threshold. We complain as minor parties, but imagine trying to get 10%
Yeah,
of
that's
the
a much
Democrats in
harder.
your town.
Okay.
That's a much
That's-
tougher
For petitioning?
petitioning
Yeah.
effort.
Oh, okay.
That's
Yeah.
a huge requirement.
It,
Yeah,
it is a really big
So
requirement.
it's basically designed to make it, we pick who's going to be on the ballot, and if you want a primary, we're going to give you a tough time on it.
So, but yeah, it's very confusing, and I think some of the confusion goes all the way up to the legislature and the Secretary of State's office. So, if I can make a plug, we have Green Party candidates, for Secretary of State and for State
Attorney General.
Assembly, and some of those rules I think are very confusing for the registrars and for the clerks. That this kind of petitioning has this kind of threshold and this kind of requirement, and that kind of petitioning has something else. It really is confusing, and my opinion is that having a Green Party member in the office would be a huge resource for these towns.
I think so too, and I think that not only for Greens, and I think that's important for people to know too, is that registrars don't do policy
Right.
work. They don't. We're not instituting our green agenda.
Right.
As much as I would love that, and that would be great,
Yeah.
I would have no ability
Right.
to do that as a registrar. We simply enact, as I understand it, whatever the policies are from the Secretary of State's office. We help to implement elections. We help
It's
to process paperwork.
process-oriented.
Yeah. So there's no, it's not like it's going to be just for Greens if I were to receive the office. All maybe
Yeah.
6 of them that are in my town that are, registered Greens. But it would be hopefully helpful for other people who may want to get elected or run for office to learn what the process is from whatever party they're of, if they don't have that system in place that the Democrats and Republicans have to kind of help them through the entire process.
Yeah, and that's true, I think, of unaffiliated people too, because I think more and more we're seeing people who are quite involved in politics who don't really want to attach themselves to a party.
Or only do briefly for the primaries. Yeah, and so you
Right.
wind up with these in name only Democrats or in name only
Yeah, for
Republicans.
72 hours.
For 90 days, you have to become a Democrat way back in January to vote in a April primary, as so many learned in 2016. We lost a quarter of the Green Party for that process, and it's just a whole lot of work for everybody that's rather unnecessary. Imagine trying to shift hundreds of voters back and forth with the season, so to speak.
Well, open primaries might be something to talk to our legislators about.
Well, sure, it might even benefit them.
Yeah, it could, you know, if anyone who was,
We, the voters, are out there, and we're larger than either of the parties.
yeah.
You know, so if you want to know how you're going to do in the general election, you might want to listen to us during the primary.
And open primaries would make it so that anyone from
Yeah,
just any citizen could vote in the primary.
yeah,
essentially,
you could
for
choose a
that primary.
party.
Well,
Okay.
Each state does it differently, but some states do it, you show up and you pick a ballot. So,
Oh,
you know,
okay.
do you have an opinion over here, or do you have an opinion over there? You could, of course, do it so that each was a separate race, and everybody votes in that primary, and everybody votes in that primary. Or you could give up primaries altogether, just do ranked choice voting, and save all that money for that whole big campaign for primary, which in many elections is where the decision is made. If you're in a town that is 3/4 Democrat, the primary is where the decision is made for
Sure.
who you're going to have represent you.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
And you're not even allowed to vote.
Oh, okay.
yeah.
Yeah, you see my point?
Yeah.
All those unaffiliated voters are not really directly connected to how the representation for the area gets done if they can't participate in the primary, which essentially selects who's on the ballot and thus who's going to be elected from a major party.
Okay, yeah.
And I noticed, you know, in East Hampton, it's more even than either in Wyndham or in New London. In
It's not
our
right size.
towns, in
Rural
our
towns tend to
towns,
be-
really, the Democratic primary is often the election.
Okay.
You know, there's often not even a Republican opponent once the Democratic primary is finished, or if there is, it's just a token or a placeholder candidate. So it's really hard. It actually took me a long time to decide to register Green, even though I was involved with the Green Party for several years, because I didn't want to give up that voting in the primary.
Okay.
And then I just
Yeah.
decided,
So-
nah.
If you think about it,
I was
about
too-
52%, 54% of our Connecticut voters are affiliated with one of these two major parties. But a lot of those are solely because of the primary. Were it not for the primary, they'd be unaffiliated, or perhaps they'd be some minor party that better represents their point of view. And so we've essentially got two large parties that are a little bit fluffed up with people who are there for only the influence of the primary. And it doesn't help them much, and it probably doesn't help
No.
us much. But there are 6 parties that you can register in statewide, and not just 2. You know, and yet only 2 are on the registration paperwork. So when you go to register and you see big party or other big party
Yeah.
as your choices, it's like there are 4 others that are valid statewide.
That's a good
Yeah.
point. Yeah.
You know, Green, one of them, the Independent Party,
Yeah.
Working Families Party, and the Libertarian Party. And they each mean well, run candidates, but you don't see them on the registration paperwork.
Yeah. Which to register Green in Connecticut, I think it's box 19 or box 11. Do we know?
Box 9, I think, but
Box 9,
nonetheless,
okay, yeah.
you,
You
but
know,
you
Right,
fill
you
in
write it
other.
in.
Right,
Yeah.
and it's a write-in, and then sometimes they can't understand what Green is and get it wrong.
I
It's
remember
amazing.
hearing that too. Yeah, that they have the
Well, we had
misregistering.
200 members of our party get registered incorrectly as not in the Green Party, and they were like some other code, GRN or something,
Yeah,
or
unqualified.
GRE.
And I actually went to our Republican registrar here, who was very helpful. He pulled up a registration card of one of these people who was improperly registered, whom I knew was a Green. He had been, this guy had been a Green for a long time, had moved out of Connecticut, moved back in. So I felt confident that he really intended to be Green. And on the Secretary of State's pull-down menu, where the registrar was entering in all the information about this person, there were two choices. One was green, and one was Green Party. And if you chose green, you got the unqualified code.
Yeah.
Really?
And if you chose Green Party, you got the correct one. I have been told the Secretary of State's office has gotten rid of that extra code since then and made the necessary repairs.
Oh, I hope so. Because
But
I tell
yeah,
everyone to just write
this
green.
happened
so.
a couple of years ago, and
Good.
our local registrar, and he was a new registrar, and how would he know that he had to say Green Party and not green? You know, people on there, if it says what party, people are writing down green. They're not really
Well,
writing
because
down
it's a
green.
handwritten entry, it's not terribly uniform. Some people will write green, some people
Yeah.
will write Green Party. But nobody gets disqualified for writing Democrat
rather
instead
than
of Democratic Party.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah,
it's like,
it was
ah!
It was very, it was a very strange.
There is, to give the professionals here some credit, there's a reason this is so murky, and that is we allow the creation of new parties on the fly. If you want to run for office and you want
Right.
to be a member of or run on the plaid party line,
Mm-hmm.
you can create the plaid party at the
You
same
can.
time you petition to office with an additional sheet of
Right.
paperwork.
Oh, okay.
And so the system needs a way to support this new and upcoming party, Plaid or Cannonball or whatever they may be. And we've had interesting party names. The Guilty Party.
The Guilty
I
Party,
love
which
that.
is a
Right.
Green
You know,
Party
and-
member
and,
who ran as a
and
Guilty
my wife
Party
has always been
line.
interested in who is the nice party. The nice party. It seems like you really want to, meet these people.
Yeah.
But there are about 120 party names in Connecticut, and most of them are just local. In my town, for instance, there's the Bottom Line. There,
Okay, in
Yeah.
East Hampton we have the Chatham Party. Which
yes,
is
yes.
A,
And-
third
Yeah,
party, a
in
in
municipal
Wellington,
third
we have the
party.
Sentinels, and in some towns, those become ruling parties because they represent sort of the sane center or some other significant group that doesn't feel represented in red or blue.
Yeah, but and then there are the four major minor parties.
Major,
Because
minor.
they're official, they have to have
that,
so much.
that are
something criteria.
recognized throughout the
Right.
state.
Well, sort of
Um,
recognized. We're not on the
sort
forms,
of.
and you can write in your party name and maybe not get in the right party. But
So everyone should talk
but
to
you're
their
allowed to.
legislators about getting that
There
form
is-
updated.
why are there not 6 parties
Oh
on
yeah,
the
no,
form?
I think that's absolutely
There should
only
be.
reasonable if
And
we're
then maybe
official.
other would be we're still waiting for you to be in the top 10.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
guilty party's not on here. But
Yeah, the
Guilty
guilty
party has to
party
get
is
bigger before we put you on the form.
Right. Yeah. So there is a lot of complications here,
Oh,
and I really feel that the Democratic and Republican people who are working in this system don't really know the ins and outs of it because they haven't until now had to learn the ins and outs of it. So I think having Greens in the registrar's office is just so important. I wanted to ask you, you had mentioned that a lot of your early activism was LGBTQ rights.
yeah,
And right now, under the current national administration, all of us are feeling very threatened, but I think in particular, the LGBTQ community is feeling very threatened. Last
tough week.
yeah,
last week, Cassandra Martineau, who was running for Registrar of Voters in Wyndham,
Yeah.
who's a trans woman, was on the show. And what I asked her, and what I'll ask you is, do you think it's important that right now members of the queer community be very visible in our communities?
I would say yes, if it's safe for them to do so and they feel safe doing so, then it can be a real personal journey sometimes for that, and as part of the whole coming out process. So I think people need to do what's right for them based on their situation. But for me, I've been out for almost 10 years and I'm very comfortable doing that, and I'm very happy to be visible and just honest about the fact that I identify as queer. I have a male partner, and make no bones about it. So, and I think it's been especially hard, especially this week, like you said, for the trans community, because they don't have as much political power as the gays and lesbians do, and people aren't as familiar with them. A lot of people know a gay person, a lot of people might know someone who's a lesbian, and we've had more visibility just over the decades, whereas the trans community is kind of marginalized sometimes even within the LGBT community. They say it's the LGB community, and then sometimes you remember the T because they're kind of an afterthought, and unfortunately that's the case sometimes, and there's even discrimination within the community against trans folks. So I think for any allies who are out there, now is a really important time for allies to step up, because there's people who are going to be feeling vulnerable, people who are feeling really frightened right now because they may not be protected under the law. There's less protections, legal protections for trans folk than there are for gays and lesbians, so I think it's really important that allies get involved and learn about it, because there's a lot to learn. And people who are gay and lesbian to learn about it too, because trans folks are members of our community, and so as a whole queer, LGBT, ABCXYZ community, it's important that we stick together. So
now, do you think it's helpful? I guess one thing that I think has changed a lot since I was a teen is with so many people out, we realize that we all have family members and neighbors and friends. So it's very personalizing and makes it easy for us straight people to be allies, because it's not abstract. And I don't know, it seems that having people in political positions of power is a piece of that as well. I know one thing that Cass mentioned in terms of voting challenges for trans people is if they change their name, do they lose their right to vote?
Yeah, no, that's a good point, and that would probably depend on what the policy is in their state, and then federal policy too, because there's the issue. And I'm not as well educated on trans issues as other people may be, but I understand that there's issues with getting the documentation updated, getting documentation to match other documentation, so that if you're going to a polling place or just trying to take a flight someplace, it can be really, they really try and obstruct you by checking all your paperwork, and if it doesn't match, they can hold you up. When I lived in Rhode Island, they were trying to get the health insurance to make exceptions, because essentially if you were a trans woman, so maybe born male, genetically male or anatomically male, and then living as a trans woman, or vice versa rather, if you were someone born female and then living as a trans man, even if you still had medical needs that a woman would have, because not all trans folks get full anatomical changes, then they wouldn't cover it, because because now you're male.
Right.
It's like,
so
well,
you
that makes
can't
no sense.
possibly
That's
need
not
this.
reality. So it can be really challenging.
And it's convenient that it saves us a few $1,000s. Yeah.
Oh yeah, so then they don't have to pay for it. But so I think, like you said, having people in political power, I think, is helpful too, and people who can both be allies to the community, but then also people who are members of the community, so that they can advocate for what's needed.
Connecticut's in much better shape than other states here. Each of the 50 states has its own mix of election law, and we're not experiencing the sort of serious ID and registration problems that some areas are. With, gee whiz, your paperwork isn't quite right and the hyphens aren't in the right places, and are there spaces around your hyphens in your name? Some states are literally trying to make anybody with a complicated name difficult to register. In our state, writing down your gender is optional on the registration form, and when you go to vote, the person who's checking you in isn't advised as to what you may or may not have said then. So we actually have all three entries, M, F, and U, and it's interesting that by town, the number of U registrations varies immensely. Mansfield's like 15%. And some rural towns are like 1.
Oh yeah.
It's like everybody's one or the other. And then in some communities, it's like, I don't even fill this out. I get tired of people asking me that question, and it doesn't even say optional on the form, but it is.
And just going off of that, I think it's important to remember that for a lot of people, when we go to vote, the last thing on our mind, or far from the first thing on our mind, is being afraid or having to fear for going to check in. Maybe you're afraid they won't have your address right, or maybe they won't,
In Connecticut,
you'll
that's
have to
your
wait
bigger
in
risk.
line. Yeah, and that's a problem. But you're not fear of being assaulted for just presenting as maybe in different clothes than someone else thinks you should have, or speaking in a way that's different because your voice is too high. You know what I mean? So with that whole gender issue that trans folks face, totally different. So having friendly faces at the polling places, having safe polling places and safe electoral processes for people like that, I think is essential, because otherwise, why would you want to risk getting attacked to go out and vote in something that you feel it's not going to make a difference anyways? And
well, and this is just one of the many demographic or characteristics that voters might fear they will be ostracized for. I mean, people of color, people of other languages, how we present, or who we consider our favorites. All of these are lifestyles and choices and characteristics, some of which we can change and some of which we can't.
And
but they shouldn't impact your ability to vote.
Right. All of that is
it's
or
useless
should
at
be
the voting site.
relevant to our voting rights.
Are you an adult? Are you an 18? Are you a resident? Enough.
Right.
Yeah, and Connecticut is by far not the worst
One of the
state.
best.
We are
one of the very best.
We have we're not too good in terms of our ballot design, in terms of our closed primaries, but I don't think voter disenfranchisement is a big problem here, whereas it is in many places. What was I reading? Some place was instituting, Georgia, a poll tax. So.
Well,
Or
they've
was
sometimes
Alabama?
called it that.
Alabama, I think, was asking.
If they make you get a rather expensive ID, and the ID is expensive to get, that's tough. If a college student has to go get a driver's license instead, and one is with their education, and one is
Another
$80, and it lasts for 6 years, and they're a senior, that's a tough buy.
Yeah.
And I think that it's very important to make sure our elections are secure and are valid, and there's integrity to the election, absolutely. But the last thing we need is to be discouraging people from voting when there's already a 30% participation rate, or very low participation rate. We need more participation, not less participation. And so the more roadblocks we set up, the less people will participate. So we need to make it easier for people to vote, not more difficult.
I know.
Well, we shouldn't be choosing who wins by who can vote.
Right.
Right.
No, if we make it difficult for Native Americans who are out there in a reservation where there may not be streets and numbers, but instead there's a post office where you go get your stuff and then you return to the reservation. But if your state requires that your ID have a street and a number, and you live where there is no street and there is no number, you have been targeted.
No, that's a good point. Yeah, absolutely.
So fortunately, I think Connecticut is not so bad, but we are seeing nationwide a big problem.
By comparison, Connecticut, to its credit, has registration by residence. Where are you physically? Which might be as simple as the park bench, or under it, or out behind the tree. But then separately, how do we reach you? Which can be a P.O. box, a mailing address, a mom's house where I go back after school. And so we have both a where do you live and a how do we reach you. And that's important to deal with people who are not in a house they've lived in for 30 years all the time, who are snowbirds, who come and go, or go to college and come back, or who don't benefit from having a steady residence, but are of this town. I live in a city where some people do not have the ability to afford an apartment every year in their life.
Oh, yeah.
But they deserve to vote nonetheless.
Yeah, I'm thinking people who may have addiction, living maybe in and out of sober homes, partially homeless, in treatment facilities. Are they not, making sure that they're able to vote and participate as well?
Now, I have a ballot, and I want to show it. This is the East Hampton ballot, And
appropriate.
so you can see where you can find
that guy.
Brian's name. It's got a circle around it. Because
That
the
doesn't
way,
count, by the way.
No, this is not how you vote for Brian. You would
Don't
have
make
to
that
fill
mark.
in the don't make that mark, or fill in the bubble, which I didn't. But the Green candidates are on line F on this year's ballot. And on all the state ballots, we have a candidate for Secretary of State, Mike DeRosa. We have Jeff Russell, who's a candidate for U.S. Senate. We have Peter Gosselin, who's a candidate for Attorney General. And we have Ed Heflin, who is candidate for Controller. And then in many other areas, we have other candidates. In the 2nd Congressional District, Michelle Louise Bicking is on the ballot. In the 1st Congressional District, Tom McCormick is on the ballot. And then we have a few scattered statewide people who are running for Registrar of Voters. Actually, this year there are quite a few.
6, I think.
Alex Foster is running in Essex. John Roush is running in Union. Cassandra is running in
Wyndham.
Wyndham. Then there's someone running in Wolcott. Yes, Brian in East Hampton.
Oh yeah, I'm running. Yeah.
And I think the Wolcott, we have Sherry Conley running. I might have missed someone. We also have a few state rep and state senate
We have some write-in candidates.
And yeah, in fact, that might be something we can talk about a little bit, because I do have here a ballot from one of these towns where there's only one candidate running for Registrar of Voters. It's the one that John is running in. It's a funny ballot, but they have a Democratic, in this last column. Oh, well, I'm being told there's 5 minutes, but there is a Democratic candidate for Registrar of Voters, but not a Republican candidate. So John is running as a Green Party candidate. He will have an easier time getting elected than you do, Brian, I'm sorry to say.
No, that's okay.
Because since there isn't a Republican on the ballot, with just a handful of votes, he, unless, I don't know if there's a write-in or not.
There could be a write-in if, for
But-
instance, a Republican had registered by this afternoon to be a registered write-in candidate, then they could mount a write-in campaign and ask 12 friends to, vote for them in the difficult
So we hope
write-in
John
spot.
gets more than 12 votes, because we want him to get in.
Well, if you've
And-
met John,
and
he's a
in-
nice guy.
Yeah, and in Deep River, actually, there's only a Republican candidate, and Sean Ames is a Green Party member, but a write-in candidate. He did not go through the petitioning process, but you can write him in by filling in the bubble and writing his name in on the Deep River ballot. So in the last 3 minutes or so, maybe you can tell people, Brian, how to get in touch with you, how they could hold signs for you at the polls, or otherwise be supportive of you in these last couple of weeks of campaigning.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. So I do have a Facebook page. It's Brian Gay for East Hampton Registrar of Voters. You can probably just search for Brian Gay, East Hampton, and it should show up. So you can like that page. I try and put information on there, either about the election process, about election integrity issues. We recently had an issue of ballots being destroyed in our town after the election, but so you can read about that on there. I'm also on Twitter at, it's also Brian Gay for East Hampton Registrar of Voters. The handle's at BGAY, my last name, and then more, and then often after that. And then I'm also on Instagram as well, also Brian Gay for East Hampton Registrar of Voters. So I'm on the 3 social media sites. You can send me an email, which is included on my Facebook page, to get in touch with me. I'm happy to answer any questions. And then in East Hampton itself, you can come and hold signs. It's at the middle school, and it's November 6th, which is in 2 weeks. So
Yeah, 6 a.m. to 8 p.m.
6 a.m. to 8 p.m. Yeah.
And
I'm
I
going to
guess,
try and have a table there as well.
and we didn't really get to it, but in our last minute, I want to mention that Connecticut does have Election Day registration If you are not registered to vote and you missed that October 30th deadline, you can go to, there's one designated spot in each town. I know in New London it's City Hall.
That's common,
And
but
I think
not
it's Town Hall
necessarily
in
the
East
case.
Hampton.
And you can register and vote all at once. We recommend that you not arrive at 5 till 8 in the evening. But if you want to register and you have not had a chance to do it, there is one last chance to exercise that right. And really, voting does make a difference.
Absolutely.
Well, Election Day registration, as offered in Connecticut, is mostly to deal with surprises and mistakes. Should something go wrong, there is one more effort you can make. But it's not a good way to register. It's a long line, and it's a tedious process.
Yeah, so it's not recommended unless you really have to.
If you have to, bravo.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Doug, and thank you, Brian. On Election Day, vote and look at all the candidates' names and look at the candidates on line F, not just A and B. I'm not quite sure what our show will be next week, but we have one last space for an election-related show before we go into some other mode. So we'll be in touch. You can go to Brian's site, and in the Green Party of Connecticut website, you can get contact info for all of our candidates. So we will see you next week, and thank you, Brian, and thank you, Doug.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Muimbe